In all my years as a US history teacher, I've never had a student that I admire and fear at the same time. Eli was in his freshman year when he had my class. He was a quiet kid with black hair and gray eyes. I learned of Eli's intelligence after the first pop quiz of the school year. For context, none of my students ever received a 100% in my quizzes or exams. So imagine my surprise when I graded Eli's quiz. I must have checked it 5 times before realizing that all of the answers were correct. I've never been so happy in my entire career. Most of my students never took my class seriously. I guess I was just unlucky enough to have irresponsible pupils. I watched Eli grin as he looked at his grade. Days passed, and Eli got perfect scores in every assignment. I never pondered how he managed to do what other students couldn't. But one incident prompted my curiosity. During a passing period, I was on my way to class when I overheard something from around the corner. I rolled my eyes as I recognized the voice of David, one of the school's problematic students. David was mad at Eli, demanding to know why he's such a nerd. I was about to stop David when Eli's response stopped me dead in my tracks. Eli claimed that he was a reincarnation of Benedict Arnold. David fell silent for a second before telling Eli that he was full of crap. Finally, I intervened, scolding David for using foul language. After sending David to the principal's office, I asked Eli if he was okay. He said he was fine, thanked me for helping him, and went to his next class. After school, I couldn't help but think about what Eli said. I've heard stories of smart kids saying something to screw with their bullies, but this was the most random one of all. History was never David's strong suit. Even if he did believe in reincarnation, I doubt he'd know who Eli was referring to. For those who don't know, Benedict Arnold was a major general from the Continental Army. During the American Revolution, he betrayed the colonies by joining the British. My class took an exam on the American Revolution the day David confronted Eli. I figured that inspired Eli's clapback about being a reincarnation of Benedict. As the school year continued, I noticed something about Eli's behavior. He became more reserved and didn't participate unless I asked him to. I also saw a look of resentment on his face. My initial thought was that David was bothering Eli again. So one day, I decided to talk to Eli after class. Eli explained that he'd just been dealing with some personal stuff and that David hadn't approached him in a while. As a teacher, I know a thing or two about students with complicated home lives. I've had a handful of students open up to me about quarrels with their parents, amongst other things. Of course, that only happened when the students felt ready to talk to me. Eli, however, did not. It wasn't until I was getting ready for my next class that something occurred to me. I hadn't seen David for about a week before I chatted with Eli. Later that day, I was chatting with my friend Gina in the teacher's lounge. She taught an algebra class that Eli was taking the same year. It turned out that the kid was excelling in all of his classes. While singing Eli's praises, I told Gina that I suspected David was picking on him again. Gina gave me a weird look as soon as I said his name. She asked me if I heard about what happened to David. Confused, I said no. At the time, I thought that David got suspended for bullying Eli, but what Gina said concerned me. She said that David was reported missing a week ago. David was last seen riding his bike home after school the day before he went missing. However, he never made it back to his house. It took about 15 minutes for David to get home by bike. That's about 2 hours before his parents came home. When they came home that day, David was nowhere in the house. At first, David's parents thought that he was visiting a friend. They were upset that their son went somewhere without their permission. But when he didn't answer his phone and found his bike in the garage, the couple began to worry. The first thing they did was call the parents of David's friends. To their horror, nobody knew where David could have gone. David's parents stayed home for hours, hoping that someone would find their son. They even refused to leave for work the following day. I was shocked when I heard this. I'll admit that I hadn't seen David for a while after his episode with Eli, but in my defense, I see so many students per day that it's impossible to keep track of who I have or haven't seen. And knowing David's track record, I would have assumed that he got suspended again, or even expelled. Despite his obnoxious behavior, I was worried for David. Even he didn't deserve whatever happened to him. So I followed the case, hoping that he was okay. It was around this time that I realized something about Eli. The day for parent-teacher conferences was coming, and I was looking up his parents' contact information when I noticed something off. The principal told me that Eli lived with only his dad, whom the student was named after. Therefore, I had only Eli Sr.'s contact information. The father's email address was rather odd. A typical email address consists of someone's surname, first name, and a few numbers in that order. Eli Sr.'s, however, was nothing like that. Instead, the email address had the numbers 9211780. What's even weirder was that those were the exact numbers of Eli Sr.'s phone number. I notified Eli Sr. of the conference date via email after school one day. He replied a few seconds later, saying that he'd be leaving for a business trip that day. I was dumbfounded, not by what Eli Sr. wrote, but by the immediate response to my email. It was as if the email was written in advance and sent right after reading mine. I just sat there, trying to understand why Eli Sr. would do this. When I couldn't think of anything, I decided to ask Eli about it the next time I saw him. Eli arrived in class 10 minutes before it began the following day. When I asked him about his dad, he responded in a way I hadn't anticipated. Eli said that his dad felt the conference to be pointless. According to Eli Sr., parent-teacher conferences are for students who fail to be the best. I was taken aback by Eli's holier-than-thou attitude. He'd never behaved like this before. Regardless, he was right about one thing. Eli had done so well in school that there wouldn't be anything to talk about. Plus, it's not like these conferences are mandatory. The school day ended, and I was on my way out of the school when I saw a notebook lying in the hallway. I opened it and immediately recognized the handwriting as Eli's. I could also tell by the content that this was the notebook he used to take notes for my class. But there was something on the first page that made me uneasy. The notes were about the American Revolution, but the way it was written was disturbingly negative. Eli was bad-mouthing the Continental Army, calling everyone things like ingrates and weaklings. I didn't know whether to be baffled or offended. How could Eli say such things? It was then that I decided to visit Eli's house. I wasn't going to tell him off or anything. I just wanted to understand why he wrote such nasty things. I drove up to Eli's house and saw a car parked in the driveway. I figured it was his dad's. I was approaching the front door when I noticed something. Eli's house had a basement window with something red smeared on it. As I got closer, I saw that it was blood. The window was slightly open, and I could see red splotches on the frame as well. I got down on the ground and peered through the window. There was someone tied to a chair with his mouth duct-taped. My heart sank as I realized that it was David. David was wearing nothing but his boxers and was covered in bruises and cuts. I guessed that he was unconscious because he didn't react when I said his name. I went quiet as soon as I heard the basement door open. Eli entered the basement and walked up to David. He then backhanded the captive, snapping him out of his state. Because the window was somewhat open, I was able to hear everything. "You should have stayed out of my way," Eli spoke in a dark tone. "But look on the bright side. At least you'll get to experience the Second American Revolution." David noticed me while Eli was talking to him. This got Eli's attention, and he looked in the same direction. When he turned to face me, I saw the knife in his hand. Eli then went up the stairs, and I booked it to my car before speeding off. I went over the speed limit without realizing it and was pulled over by an officer. I told him what I'd witnessed and gave him Eli's address. When the police arrived at Eli's house, they found David alive, but that wasn't all. A man's corpse was found in the master bedroom's closet, later identified as Eli Sr. He was stabbed in the lung with an unidentifiable blade before being dragged into the closet. The car was missing from the driveway, plus most of Eli's belongings. It was apparent that Eli fled the scene before the police could catch him. David was taken to the hospital, and the police started looking for Eli. Eli was tall for his age, so nobody would think he was too young to drive by himself. I cursed myself for not getting the license plate number. It turned out that Eli Sr. was killed after the first week of the school year. This meant that Eli was the one trying to evade parent-teacher conferences. I was taken in for questioning while David recovered in the hospital. With our combined testimonies, I was able to get an idea of Eli's story. On the day David went missing, he cornered Eli during a passing period. Like a typical bully, David ordered Eli to do his homework. Eli agreed and promised to have it done by 6 o'clock. David went home to play video games before leaving for Eli's house. Since their houses were pretty close, he decided to walk there. When Eli invited David into his house, he knocked the bully out before bringing him to the basement. David woke up later with a gash in his head. He tried to escape through the window when Eli caught him and knocked him unconscious again. This time, Eli tied him up. He tortured David while revealing his story. Eli felt that the Continental Army didn't give him the prestige he deserved when he was Benedict Arnold. Fed up with the insolence of his fellow soldiers, Benedict became a turncoat. But of course, he failed. On his deathbed, Benedict vowed to take revenge on the country that had forsaken him. When Benedict came back as Eli, he started plotting his revenge. For years, Eli hid his schemes from his dad, but then Eli Sr. discovered the truth and died at the hands of his son. The police soon found that the email address I tried to contact Eli Sr. with was Eli's. However, there was one thing about this that I couldn't understand. What did Eli mean when he told David that he'd get to experience the American Revolution? David never learned anything of Eli's plan or what he meant either. It's been several months and the police still haven't found Eli. I keep a bat under my bed in case that lunatic comes after me next. I'm still not entirely convinced that Eli was a reincarnation of Benedict Arnold. It could explain how he knew the American Revolution so well, but on the other hand, he could have just been that good a student. I often wonder what Eli's American Revolution would be. Whatever it is, I doubt that any good would come out of it.